listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Do you need nitrogen, but it's all locked up in the atmosphere? Then diazotrophic bacteria will fix your problem. The sponsor of this episode, diazotrophic bacteria makes your nitrogen usable. Free the nitrogen!
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the podcast, and my name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. And each week, I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share about a plant that means something to me. And through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Now, today is another one of those special episodes where we're only going to be talking about one plant, but before we get to that, I want to talk about the difference between hardwood and softwood. Now, I don't think the word hardwood comes up in this episode, but we are talking about a tree that is a hardwood, and that had me thinking about the difference of a hardwood versus a softwood. And I remember it being more complicated than just what seems obvious, hardwoods are hard, softwoods are soft. But I wanted to dig into it and understand it a little bit better, and I thought I would share that with you. Now, generally, hardwoods are harder than softwoods. Now, they're both wood. They're not super soft. There's not many wood that you would want to get hit with because they're not like a foam bat or something. They're quite hard. But hardwoods in general are harder than softwoods, but not in every case. For example, balsa is considered a hardwood, and yew, that's Y-E-W, in some cases is quite hard, even though it is a softwood. And so the difference actually has more to do with what kind of plant they are. So the hardwoods are angiosperms, and the softwoods are gymnosperms. And there's a few other characteristics that go with that, but let's just define those two terms first. So angiosperms means that the seed is enclosed, normally in a fruit or a nut, and the gymnosperms means that the seed is open. Generally how the seeds are seen in pine cones. They're open to the air. They're not surrounded by a fleshy or meaty material like a nut. And so that's kind of the main difference between the two. It has to do with their seeds. But also, and I'm not quite sure why they're related, but the angiosperms have a different cellular structure of the wood. And that cellular structure tends to have tighter grain. And they tend to grow slower because of that tight, and which leads to that tighter grain. Whereas the softwoods, which are gymnosperms, have a looser cellular structure. They grow faster, which tends to have that softer characteristics. There is a few more differences between the two, but that's generally the rule. I think in general, hardwoods are deciduous and broadleafed, and the softwoods are evergreen and have needles. But there's actually some exceptions to that. There's actually several evergreen trees that are actually hardwoods, and so that's just general rules, but it really comes down to actually the angiosperm versus the gymnosperm. Really, that is the main dividing line, and I think it's easier to say hardwood versus softwood instead of saying angiosperm and gymnosperm. At least that's what I assume. Maybe it's kind of easier in a woodworking context to talk about hardwood versus softwood. So anyway, that's the definition of those two things. It's clarified for me in my mind now, so thank you for letting me explain that to you. Every time I do that, it helps me understand something better. So one of the reasons I started this podcast. So thank you for learning along with me. And with that, let's meet our guest.
So, what do you think?
I know you spent a lot of money on this place, Fry, but it's awfully primitive. The floors are made of such hard wood.
Hi, Lynn. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, I do. The plant that I'm going to share with you, and it felt like a little bit of a cheat, because I know that trees are plants, so it's totally legitimate.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But part of me forgets sometimes that that's what they are, because they seem so completely other sometimes.
Yeah.
So the plant that I'm going to share with you is the birch tree, because that's my absolute favorite.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit weird right now. I'm going to play I'm good. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. I'm going to play a weird sound effect. And that sound effects means that this is a special episode, and we're only going to talk about one plant today, not two, because I also am going to talk about birch, because I realized when you mentioned to me that, so that is a plant that's also meaningful to me in a very specific way. So I'm going to let you take the lead here and talk most about it. I don't actually have a ton of research about it, but I have a few things that are pretty relevant to why birch is also meaningful to me.
Oh, that's brilliant. Cool. I feel very honored that I got the sound effect. That's awesome.
It's fun. I had to I don't know if you can see, I had weird wires and stuff on this device I have because the battery died, and I had to reconfigure it to run off of USB. It's totally hacked together, but it died today. I was oh no, I have to play the sound effect. So since I did that, I'm gonna do that one more time. Lynn can see all the weird wires I have. There we go. Special episode.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So the birch tree is the plant that I want to share with you. It's when you got in touch and you said a special plant, I immediately went to that one. My granddad, and I don't know if many of your podcasts are like this, but my granddad was a beekeeper. And
I am also a beekeeper, by the way.
Are you?
Yeah, I am.
Oh,
so
amazing.
I'm really excited about this.
Oh,
I don't know where
cool.
this is. I don't know how this is connected to birch. Actually, I'm excited, but yes.
So my granddad was one of the best beekeepers in the northeast of Scotland. His name was Bill Dryden. He was an absolute legend, and he had a big yellow van that looked like a giant bee to me when I was a kid. It wasn't stripy or anything, but it just felt really appropriate that it was a big yellow van. And he would put his beehives in the back of the vans, and he would take his beehives up to the Glens in Angus, which is the region of Scotland that I live in. And he would take out the beehives and put them in the glens. So he would have specific heather honey, clover honey. So he was really particular about the positioning of his beehives. And when he did that, he would plant birch trees wherever he went. Which is so cool. He genuinely was my first sort of lesson in natural abundance. And I didn't even know that was, that was what was happening when I was a kid. He always said, Lynn, if you want to make friends, give them a plant cutting or a little tree and you'll have a friend for life. And it's true. I use this. When I went to my new job, I gave out some plants to people to just spread the vibe. So my granddad would go around the northeast of Scotland planting birch trees. And the city that I live adjacent to now, I'm not in the city anymore, but the city that I live adjacent to, Dundee, and that's where he lived. And he planted birch trees that are still around. He's not anymore, unfortunately. But he planted birch trees that were still around. So I remember I was maybe about 7 or 8, and I was asking, Granddad, what's your favourite tree? And he said, birch trees. I plant them everywhere. And then he told me about what he did when he went out with his bees, and that he planted trees near the old railway line near Dundee. And that really stuck with me. And I tuned into birch trees from that point. Silver birch in particular, because of that really beautiful papery bark that they have. I think they're beautiful. There's something really... I think the word haunting is the only one I've got at the moment, but that seems a little bit dramatic.
No, I totally get it.
Oh, amazing. Good. No, there's something quite haunting about a birch tree, the way it droops, the beautiful way that the leaves hang off it, and the way that they change from that beautiful, really lime green bud to a silvery back, into the tail end of summer. They get that richer, deeper green with the silver running through it in the leaves. And then they just turn, it seems, on a dime to this incredible, vibrant sunshine yellow in that kind of last show of autumn. I just think they are gorgeous. And then in the winter, they're just these beautiful branches just hanging. And there's nothing more gorgeous, I think, than a foggy morning. Where I live, it's on the coast, the east coast of Scotland, and we get a lot of har. I don't know if that means anything to you.
I don't know what that word means.
Okay, so har is like sea fog. It's the fog that comes in off the sea.
How do you spell that?
Haar.
Okay, cool.
I will be dropping in quite a lot of Scots words into this.
I'm so excited for that. That's really exciting. I love that. I do have some Scottish heritage. So I'm very interested in that. I've been to Scotland a couple times. Haven't explored it as much, but I am really fascinated in all the vocabulary. It's really, really interesting to me.
Cool. Well, strap in. I will dish out some for you.
Wonderful.
As we chat. So we get a lot of har here. So sea fog, it rolls in off the North Sea, and it can be a beautiful sunny day, like 2 miles inland, but you're at the coast and it's grey, it's dim, it's dismal. But when it starts to lift and it condenses on birch trees in the wintertime, and you just get these beautiful globules of just, condensed air on the branches, and it just sparkles, and I think it's beautiful, just their shape. So birch trees, I think they have a beautiful aesthetic, and they've also got a couple of really interesting uses that I want to talk to you about as well.
Awesome. I'm excited about that because I know about maybe a few, but before we get into that, I have some questions, particularly maybe about your grandfather, and also some other stuff that's just coming into my head about maybe Scotland and birch trees. But also maybe for the audience who's never seen birch, one thing I think is particularly stunning about them is they're like almost white, the bark, right? At least the ones you're talking, not all of them, I guess. There's a lot of birch, but the silver birch, it has this very particular look, like you can spot it from a mile away because it's got this really light colored bark.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. And you can see them through, so they also grow in pine plantations. We've got Forestry Commission land here in Scotland, which is really regimented pine plantations. And birch trees are one of the only trees that can grow there. The soil's quite sterile, and there's not an awful lot going on in the soil nutrition-wise, but birches can grow between the pines. And you catch glimpses of this really ghostly, the ghostly colour of the trunk is really cool if you're walking past a pine forest. Yeah, they're stunning.
Yeah, so cool. So, okay, about your grandfather, have you seen any of the trees he's planted? I've been like, oh, those are the ones he planted?
Yeah. Every time we drive past the old railway line at Lochee, which is a suburb of Dundee, my mum points them out.
Oh, so cool.
So it's like,
and how big are they now?
They're really tall. It's amazing. They're adult birch tree sized is probably the best way to put it. There's not a lot of natural competition because birch trees will get super tall if they are forced to. But they're a decent size of birch tree and a good girth of trunk. And it's just really nice to see them every time we go past.
And that's really cool. Do you know why he decided to plant birch trees?
They'll grow anywhere, and he thought they were beautiful.
Wow.
He really liked them. And so, but they're also super lucky because they are really, really hardy. They look super delicate, I think, just with the way that they're formed. But they grow anywhere. So I think he thought this is an easy way to do some guerrilla tree planting. He was ahead of his time, was Bill Dryden. Yeah.
Totally. That's so cool. And so the other thing I'm thinking about now, one of the things that I know a little bit about Scotland and generally like the British Islands in general, and we have a kind of a similar thing in the United States, but it's quite a bit younger, but it's this, a lot of the trees in the British Isles were cut down centuries and centuries ago. And there's areas in part of Scotland that were forest that have not been forest for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I think it's really amazing for someone to make this kind of decision to like help, at least in some little way, change that, right? That's so cool.
It is super cool. I don't think he wasn't thinking about reforesting. I think he was just like, this is a nice thing to do. Like it's just keeping nature going, giving back. He had I would love to have a conversation with him now, the person that I am now, because he died when I was a lot younger. But I'd love to have a chat with him now about abundance and understanding cycles of nature and rewilding and all of that good stuff. I think he'd be really into it.
Really, really fascinating. And what's that old adage that, the great men plant trees whose shade they will never rest in?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I need to plant more trees. I've planted a few in my yard, but I gotta plant some trees.
Yeah. It's a good thing to do. It is a good thing to do. I also haven't done that. But I do have silver birches in my garden. As a happy coincidence. So yeah. So
cool. Okay, I think for now that covers the questions I have about your grandfather's practice. But yeah, it's so cool. What a cool thing to do when beekeeping. Oh man, I just love that whole that whole history in Europe of beekeepers who move their bees around to get specifically for honey. We don't really have that as much in the U.S. We have this big commercial operation where beekeepers basically sell pollination services, and the honey is kind of like an afterthought a little bit. and it's much more industrial. They move like, I mean, it's a ridiculous. It's like the corporatization of this European tradition, and it's very strange. So I really love hearing about those traditions in Europe because they're also, I haven't heard about this in Scotland before, but they're also very particular to areas, but every kind of European culture kind of has their own version of that, which is super, super cool.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
that's amazing.
That's really cool to hear. Yeah.
Have you, this is a total aside and a bit of a rabbit hole.
I love rabbit holes and tangents, so please continue.
Have you heard about the tradition of telling the bees? So when a beekeeper dies, someone has to go and let the bees know that they're now going to be living with someone else. And it's just I don't know where that came from. I'm sure it's easily Googleable. But yeah, I think it's a little bit morbid and quite beautiful for it. And I'm into that sort of thing. So yeah, another interesting little bee tradition.
That is, yeah, I had heard that before, and I think that's a really, really cool tradition. Do you know if anyone told the bees about your grandfather when he passed away?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's so cool, man.
It's happening.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm going to cut this part out. I'm just trying to, my child is crying a little bit in the other room. We're just gonna have her
how old's your kid?
She is 7 months.
Oh, congratulations. How are you finding it?
Thank you so much. Really, really good. Well, maybe I won't cut this out because you're talking about it. I was listening to your podcast, and you have a kid too.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this thing about how like trying to like find time to go out into nature, in this case, mushroom forays, and then thinking about trying to get childcare, but then thinking, wait a minute, no, I should just take my kid with me.
Yeah.
And that really stuck with me. I got to think about that more as well.
Oh, cool. Oh, I'm really glad because I made a really glib comment about, I need to get childcare to do this thing. And I was like, no, Lynn, take him with you. And it might be a nightmare, but it might also be brilliant.
Yeah.
And that's the gamble that you take as a parent, isn't it? Like,
yeah, it's really good. Also, you used the phrase, which I think is very Scottish, but it's super charming to American. You called him your wee boy, which I love that. I love that. I was like, oh, I got to take my wee girl outside. It's a great term.
Thank you. Yeah, totally. I forget. I forget that to people outside Scotland, the way I speak and the things that I say can be quite exotic sounding.
Yeah, that's good. So audience, if you hear the baby in the background, she's fussing a little bit. So apologies for that, but that's the world we live in.
Oh yeah, it's the reality of it.
Yeah, it's great. Okay. Let's get to some fun facts and dazzling details about Birch. You're going to talk about uses or anything else you want to share about that.
Cool, thank you. So one thing that I am really into and that I do as part of my kind of creative practice is I perform Scots folk music and poetry and do shows based around different themes from the Scots tradition. So birch trees feature, I'm not going to say heavily because that's quite a statement. But sure. There's a few of my favourite poems that feature birch trees and are specifically about birch plantations and birch woods. And I just wondered, can I share some of those with you?
Oh, yes, please. That's awesome.
Amazing.
Wow.
So the first one is, have you heard of Robert Burns?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
He's the guy. He's the Scottish poet.
Yeah, he is the Scottish poet. Yes, he is. I love him. I'm an absolute Burns maniac. I think he's amazing. And he wrote a song called The Birks of Aberfeldy. Now, Aberfeldy is a gorgeous little village, town/village in Perthshire, which is in the central part of Scotland. And it's an absolutely stunning poem. And I just wanted to read it for you. I'm not going to sing the song because, to be honest, I don't know the tune by heart. And someone just randomly singing on a podcast can be lovely, but also quite alarming. So I'm not going to do that to you. So this is The Birks of Aberfeldy by Rabbie Burns. Now summer blinks on flowery braes, and o'er the crystal streamlets plays. Come let us spend the lithsome days in the Birks o' Aberfeldy. The little birdies blithely sing, while o'er their heads the hazels hang, or lichtly flit on wanton wing in the Birks o' Aberfeldy. The braes ascend like lofty wa's, the foamy stream deep roaring faws, o'erhung wi' fragrant spreading shaws, the Birks o' Aberfeldy. The hoary cliffs are crowned wi' flowers, while o'er the lins the burnie pours, and rising weeps wi' misty showers, the Birks o' Aberfeldy. Let fortune's gifts at random flee, they ne'er shall draw a wish fi me. Supremely blessed we love and thee in the Birks o' Aberfeldy. Now, if you haven't guessed, Berks is the Scots word for birch. So this is a lovely wee poem about spending time by crystal streams, beautiful waterfalls, gorgeous hills covered in mosses, surrounded in the peace of birch trees. And I just think it's such a beautiful ode to that particular tree that we have here in Scotland, and such a love for it.
And it's the thing that I was, and this is going to tie into what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And I don't think he was maybe thinking about it in the way we think about it now, but it's like a very lovely conservationist poem, almost, right? Of talking about this kind of nature that that has such value, and not everyone recognizes that. That was really amazing.
Absolutely is. And there's a statue of Burns looking very pensive on a bench at the area where the poem was written.
Cool.
It's really cool. It's well worth a visit. I think we can get a little bit cheesy with Burns. I say at times a lot. We can get really cheesy with him in Scotland, but there's a quiet dignity about that statue that I think is better than some of the ones where he's looking very grand holding a book, like the ones in the centre of Edinburgh or Dundee or any city that you might possibly think of that has a Burns statue. The other poem is shorter. I want to share with you. There's a poet called Marian Angus who doesn't get nearly enough press, I think, from Scotland. She was around at the start of the 20th century, and she's from just up the road from where I live, which is lovely to have that kind of literary reference with the place that I live. One of my favourite poems by hers is called Trees, and it's about birches specifically. The first two verses aren't relevant to this because it's about villages where you grow up and then looking at the glens and being a little bit misty-eyed for them. But the final verse is specifically about birches. And it's wood of the birches, the pretty fine trees of you, silver and grey, the fine little breeze of you. All the length of the day, there's nothing they say but what I would hear in the peace of you, in the peace of you. And there's this sentiment in that last stanza about losing yourself in the woods, tuning into the silence and realizing that there's nothing that anyone can say to you that you can't learn from the wisdom of nature. And that just totally vibes with my general sort of ethos around spending time in nature. Yeah.
Very, very well said. That's cool. I'll definitely put some links to those poems in the show notes because those are really cool and probably people want to reflect on those more.
Cool. That'd be lovely. Thank you. So I want to share a little bit of poetry and also just some kind of like fun, esoteric, I say fun, maybe fun if it's your bag.
Yeah. I mean, people listen to this podcast. If it's about plants, it's fun.
Fair. The thing is, like, I don't know about you, with my podcast, like, I'm not an expert on mushrooms. Like, I just really love them.
That's why I contact you, because I'm the same. Like, I'm a very beginner on plants, but I think they're super cool. And so I was like, oh, this is like a similar podcast about with mushrooms. And it's a cool way because it's a cool way to talk to people from. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Continue.
It's a nice way to learn.
Yeah.
So my connection with most of this stuff is through aesthetic, because I like the look of something, or I like the symbolism behind it, or I do a bit of research. And like with birch trees, I love them because they've got a really feminine energy about them. They look very delicate, but they can survive literally anywhere. They're very tough, but they're gorgeous. They provide shelter and all those really lovely things. But they're associated in Celtic folklore with the kind of the turn of the year. So the first month of the lunar calendar is Birch. She welcomes the year in. And I think it runs from, I want to say, the 24th of December to the 20th of January. And my birthday falls in that date. And I just wonder, is there a little bit of like, is there a little bit of... is my fondness dictated by when I was born? Probably not, and it's much more the granddad thing, but I like to think that might be something.
Cool. Wow.
I'm also going to check up a couple of other facts that I have sitting on my browser. Yes, there is. First lunar month of the Celtic tree calendar is the birch tree, and it's also known as the Lady of the Woods. Deep feminine connections is a symbol of rebirth and fertility. It's elegant, which is made known by its delicate, peeling, silvery white bark, which is the first thing that comes up on Google, which I just think is super cute. But there's one thing about birch trees is their hardiness and their unwelcomeness in those pine forests that I was talking about. So in Scotland, vast swathes of our land is owned by the Forestry Commission. So this is like our commercial tree growing and cutting down organisation. And my dad, when I think he was 16, he did an apprenticeship with them. And he still refers to birch trees as weeds because they'll grow in those pine plantations. And they'll get really, really tall. Like, they don't shy away from the pine trees competing for light. There's a place that I love to go in May, which is a bluebell wood, it's about half an hour drive from where I live. And it is absolutely stunning. And before you get to the bluebell wood, there's a really big Forestry Commission plantation, or there was before it starts. They all get cut down as they were harvesting the trees, which is a weird thing to say, and I don't think I like it, but here we are. And there's a single birch tree that stands just a ridiculous, imagine the height of a really tall pine tree. It's that high. So birch trees don't usually get that high, but this thing has absolutely just shot up and done its best to compete for the light. And I just love that it's such a hardy thing. And now it stands on its own. And the last time I was there, it was super windy. And this thing was swaying and bending, never breaking, because it's just this outrageously hardy thing. And I think it's just such a gorgeous, feels like a metaphor for something very profound, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's super interesting. That this is also going to come out in a little bit, but the forestry and the timber and harvesting trees is really interesting. We've talked about that in a couple other episodes, and it is always, on one hand, like, it's a really great renewable material, but on the other hand, sometimes the way that tree farming is done, and I don't know anything about Scotland, maybe it's done like better than other places, but there's places in the US where it's just like entire massive forests are just now these monocultures of pine, essentially, or fir, and it's kind of this weird distortion of what a forest really is, because you're not a forest if you only have one. And in particular in Oregon, where they grow Douglas fir, they don't let things like birch grow because they douse the stuff in pesticides that kill all broadleaf plants, and so the only thing that can grow is Douglas fir, which is pretty messed up.
Yeah. Oh man, what are we doing?
Huge industry over here. Yeah.
What are we doing? I do know that in Scotland, and this kind of segues a little bit into my next point about birch trees and the fungi that grow next to them, because I'm obsessed. There's organisations in Scotland that are looking at how those plantations can actually enrich the soil if you just put mushroom mycelium in and around the root ball. So you can actually start to introduce a richer soil culture through the plantation, as long as you add mycelium to the root balls of the baby pine trees, which, is just... it seems like such a simple solution when you start to understand how soil works, but it's something that we just haven't done previously. So yeah, that's really exciting to me. So yeah, it's something that we're doing here in Scotland. I don't know if it's a wide practice, but I have spoken to some people that are involved in that.
Very fascinating, yeah.
And it's cool stuff. But on to birch trees and their fungi, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Yes.
Cool. So as well as my favourite birch tree, my favourite plant, which is birch trees, my favourite mushroom is fly agaric, which is Amanita muscaria. It's your typical fairy tale toadstool, bright red cap, white spots on it, little frill around the stem. Absolutely love them. And they have a mycorrhizal relationship. They exist in and around pine and birch trees. So where you find birch, you can also find amanitas. And what Amanita muscaria. And what I absolutely love about that is just the colour juxtaposition between the red and the silver. I just think it's absolutely stunning.
That is, I can imagine. I've seen a couple of the Amanita muscaria in the wild, but never around birch, mostly around spruce, I think.
They do the same with that. It's very cool.
Yeah, they're cool looking mushrooms. I don't really have anything quite like that over here. That's a very European mushroom. There's a lot of European mushrooms that have an equivalent or even sometimes a very similar cousin over here.
Oh, okay.
But the fly agaric, I think, is one that that we don't really have something exactly like that with those spots. It's kind of like that's very much like a European fairy tale forest thing that we don't really get to see here much.
It totally
Maybe I'm wrong
is.
about that. Mushroom people, feel free to correct me, but I haven't seen anything like that. We have some other red mushrooms and some other stuff like that, but the ones with the polka dots like that are I don't think we have anything quite like that.
They're super cool, and they're starting to spread. So they're starting to actually pop up in Australia now as well, which is really interesting because they're not.
Wow.
That's not where they're from.
Yeah. Wow.
And that could be potentially problematic, but we don't know how problematic that will be yet, because they might just be bullying out native species that haven't been discovered yet, or are really delicate, or hold a balance in the ecosystem. So there's some interesting fungal footprints happening across the world right now.
I forget the difference in this vocabulary, and you probably know this, but the amanita is one of the mushrooms that is a more symbiotic and not a decaying mushroom. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah,
yes.
I
So they
forget those
usually
words.
have I can't. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about the wording either. See,
There's
not an
mushrooms you
expert.
find on like rotting wood, and there's the mushrooms you find coming out of the ground.
Yes, they're ground mushrooms. They're not rotting wood mushrooms.
Yeah, cool.
But anyone listening, please feel free to correct me on that.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
open to additional
Mushrooms
knowledge.
are like a whole thing. Man, they're so cool. I mean, you have a whole podcast about them. I highly recommend the audience listen to Scotland on Shrooms.
Thank you.
But yeah, I'm interested in mushrooms too, but I know even less that I feel like I'm not the person to talk about it on a podcast. But yeah, they are so fascinating. I mean, wow.
They properly are. And birch trees have two other mushrooms that grow on them. One is chaga, which is such a cool name, and I don't know the origin of that. I should probably look that up. Chaga I've only really become aware of it in the past year. I went on a foraging walk with a really cool organisation up in Aberdeenshire, and the guy running the foraging walk said, "Oh, we're gonna be looking for chaga," and I was like, I don't know what that is. What's that? And he's like, "Oh, it's a fungus that grows on birch trees, and it's incredibly good for you." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And it looks like a burr on the trunk. It looks like just a growth, or like a piece of burnt wood. And birch trees do sometimes have like these really big sort of cankers, like these big growths on them. Those can easily be confused for chaga. Chaga is tends to grow quite high up. It's quite dark. It looks like a burnt piece of tree. And it's also, incredibly good for you in terms of being anti-inflammatory, antiviral. Like, it's really sought after and a really expensive bit of fungus. So if you can get your hands on some chaga and sell it, then you're making yourself a little bit of money, which is cool. But also, it can take a long time for a really good piece of chaga to grow. So I always feel a bit, that thing's like 15 years old. You might want to calm down if you're harvesting. So chaga, really good for you, grows on birch trees. And also the birch polypore, which is one of those mushrooms that is a decaying mushroom. I'm distracted by your cat.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's Cheeto. There's three of them. I think they're all in here right now, maybe. But that's Cheeto. He really likes to be on my lap when I'm on calls. This is his time
so
to sit on my lap.
cute.
Yeah. Hi, Cheeto.
Hi, Cheeto. Sorry, where was it? A birch polypore.
Yeah.
Which is a bit more, it's more common than chaga and only grows on birch trees. And it was actually found, and there was an Iceman found, I'm just going to open my browser.
Utsi the Iceman.
Yes, that guy.
I have this in my notes.
Ah, cool. So
he was a big fan of birch in a few ways. I don't know if you have all of his birch stuff, but please tell us about the mushroom. I was wondering. I had the scientific name of this mushroom, but I didn't know that one, so I was wondering if we could bring it up. But please carry on, and then maybe I'm going to chime in with the other birch-related things related to Utsi, the Swiss Iceman.
Yes, yeah. So he had birch polypore in his little pouch. He was apparently this poor guy seemed quite afflicted by a range of health issues, one of which was some kind of parasitic worm. And the birch polypore was being used, they think, to treat his symptoms. It's an antiviral and it's antiseptic and really just generally quite brilliant for you. And it's just this really common fungus that grows on birch trees, and you see them all the time. And there's just this medicine growing out of birch trees that we just don't necessarily ever really engage with because of the society, the culture that we live in now. It just doesn't quite lend itself to that.
That's super fascinating. Yeah, so Utsi the Iceman, that's one of the things that came up when I was talking about birch, and I remembered And I didn't know about the mushroom part. I just literally found that out today when I was re-looking up him for another birch-related thing. Cool. And so just to remind the audience, I talked about this back in episode 8 when we were talking about Edelweiss and Creosote, and somehow Ötzi came up from my guest. And Ötzi, it's a very Swiss word. He was found in Switzerland. I think in like a glacier melted, and he like popped up. And it was a very well-preserved, like Stone Age or Bronze Age or something like that guy. I forget how old, 5,300-year-old mummy, essentially. He was very well preserved, and he had all of his stuff on him, which was like a really cool insight into how people lived then. And one of the things, he had this satchel with the mushrooms. Another birch thing that he had with him was 2 birch baskets, which I don't know if you have anything in your notes about how birch is used, but like the bark or like peeling off the thin layers, you can make really fine baskets or other things like that, which is cool, and I didn't realize that.
I did not realize that either. This is brilliant.
Yeah, so he had 2 birch baskets with him, and then the one thing I remember, and the reason I Googled him to talk about today, is that he had an axe with him, and the axe had an ash handle, and then the blade was attached with leather, but then it was covered over with birch tar. And there's a process, and if audience go back and listen to episode 8, my guest Christian, who actually does the music for the show, he was talking about how his dad had read about that, and so then they decided to make some birch tar, and essentially you take a bunch of the papery bark and you stack it in some kind of enclosed, and they did it in a coffee can, some kind of enclosed container, and you just stick it in the fire and you burn it for a really long time. In the lack of oxygen, well, you got to be enclosed. And it turns into this super, super sticky. It's like Stone Age epoxy. And so he wrapped his axe really tight with a leather, and then smeared this tar all over it, and it made it into this very solid thing, which is pretty cool. So a cool other property of birch is that you can make this like very, very sticky stuff with it.
That's so awesome.
But I think dries very hard too. I think
that's really cool. He was doing the most he possibly could with birch trees, right? Like that's
yeah. So that's cool. Yeah, I didn't realize like when I Googled him that he had 3 birch related things on him, including a mushroom, which was super cool. So yeah, I was wondering if you're going to bring up that one. That one was as common as well, but I guess the scientific name for that one is Fomitopsis betulina.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That's really cool. Thank you.
I'm really into the nomenclature stuff. If the audience will know, sometimes I go too deep on that. Before I get into some of my other fun facts, what else do you have to share? You mentioned if there's any. I don't know if there's any other uses you have, or any other fun facts or dazzling details you want to share about birch.
Yeah. So my day job is in economic development. So I have historically, this is very dull, but it's not, it's great. I have historically worked with businesses and kind of helping them figure out their value proposition and what their mission is and look at their target markets and all that sort of stuff. Like I can get quite geeky about that sort of thing as well. And one of the businesses that I worked with, and it was starting to become a much more common trend, is birch water. So putting a spile into birch tree and then essentially using it as a tap and then draining the tree of birch water, and just the health properties of that is amazing. But what I'm finding really interesting and what I'm kind of looking to explore on my own podcast as well is the economy that's now springing up in and around health and well-being, and how we're reconnecting with kind of traditional methods of just getting good stuff out of plants. And there is a trend now for birch water here in Scotland. The people that I was working with was based in Perthshire. So like just, near the Birks of Aberfeldy that Rabbie Burns had written about. And I find that a really interesting thing that's happening now, this economy that's surging around well-being and ecology and how we exist with plants, and then packaging it and selling it to us. I think that's a really interesting thing that we're doing. Because what's stopping me from just getting a spile and just go into a birch tree and having a go, I think it's, so brilliant thing that they do. And it's interesting how we're commercializing it, and no shade to any of those companies. Like, I think it's brilliant that awareness is being raised, but then there's something about this is knowledge that we have that we could just be maybe using for free.
Yeah. And it's a complicated thing for sure. There is definitely markets are fine. Ötzi the caveman was probably buying and selling stuff from people. That's something that humans do, right?
Yeah.
But I think in modern times we have this like tendency to sometimes go way too far. So the example I gave with the spruce in, the fir trees in Oregon, right? It's just I mean, it's this massive industry now, and it's completely changed a whole entire part of the country to be this like economic machine instead of what it was. So the balance is the key, and I think we've been pretty bad as humans as balance for the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, and I think longer than that.
Maybe maybe 200 or so. Maybe we can start figuring that out, and I think some of that is finding these other industries that aren't just the and maybe this will get into some of my facts here, but one of the things that people do with birch mostly is just use it for timber, which is fine, but you can also finding the balance there. So having a renewable resource from birch, like the water, is really interesting to me. I was in Alaska, which has a lot of birch as well, and I bought some birch syrup, which they're making syrup the same way you make maple syrup, but essentially you take the water and you just boil it down until it's a syrup, because there's sugars in the that's one of the things that makes the birch water different from just water, is it has sugar, but it also has other micronutrients and stuff in it. So I have a little bit of birch syrup, but it's quite expensive because the boil down is very intense. So there are some European maples, but are there any maples in Scotland?
We don't. It's not something. Yeah, I'm sure there are some, but I don't. There's nothing really that springs to mind. I'm like, oh yes, there's a maple plantation here or there. Yeah.
This continent is very lucky to have maples, and maples are super cool, specifically the sugar maple, which has the highest, I think, sugar content of like any tree. And so when you tap a maple tree and you want to make syrup, you don't have to boil off near as much water, and birch, I think, is like way, way, way higher. But there are some people in Alaska making birch syrup, which is pretty cool. So like really, taking that. But the water thing is cool. Like I've been drinking I have a maple tree in my backyard that I've made syrup, and one of my favorite things is just to drink the water or to make coffee with the water, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Or tea. But you could use birch water like that too. So that's cool. And I think I've actually picked up, someone was importing birch water. I think it was from Eastern Europe. I bought a boxed water, but it was like birch water from Europe somewhere a while ago. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling. But that is super interesting. That's becoming a thing. Can you buy that in a store in Scotland?
Yeah.
So cool.
It's becoming much more prevalent. It's sort of like little farm shops and things, cool little boutique little shops. But yeah, it's not out in the supermarkets yet. But it is around, and I just think it's brilliant, and it's quite a fascinating thing.
Yeah, people are selling some maple water like that here too, and I've heard people say that it's all of us who live up in these more northern countries are like importing all this coconut water, but the birch water or the maple water is kind of the same. It has the same properties. It's really great for hydration. It's got some good micronutrients and stuff. So maybe it's a better way to do than shipping coconut water all around the world.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
So let me share a couple things with you. I'm gonna try to think of how I piece this together. Let me just get a couple just basic stuff that I always like to talk about out of the way, and then I'll get into the kind of the like last part, which maybe is a little bit of a bummer, but let's see how it goes. One thing I want to mention about birch for people who don't know about it, birch is really interesting in that it is a genus of trees. So there's many birch species in the genus. Betula is the genus. And it is very widespread. If you look at the distribution of birch trees, it essentially is like the whole upper part of the planet. Like every single, like from around where I am in Virginia, north, and then basically a band around the whole world, there are birch trees growing in all of the temperate and boreal forests around the world. So very widely distributed, which I think is very fascinating. So it's kind of cool that you can be talking about birch, but I also have birch here, and they're pretty similar, in the same genus, and the same thing is true, all over this area. So it's very, when talking about the hardiness, it's so hardy, it can really grow in a very, very wide area. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's really cool. Yeah. And hardy as anything. Yeah, they're brilliant.
And then that name Betula, the genus name, apparently comes from the Gaulish word. So those are the Gauls, the Proto-French civilization. And the word betu means bitumen or asphalt, and that's a reference to the tar that was used to make it. So that scientific name is related to that use of making tar from it, which is pretty cool.
That's so cool. Oh, I love that. I
Yeah.
love that. Thank you for that fact.
So those are like the main like facts I have. But now, as far as like the main reason why it's meaningful to me, I remembered Birch because I remembered my friend telling me the story. But let's see. But my main reason about Birch. So in my day job, I work in communications for an environmental nonprofit, and that often leads to learning lots of interesting things, but also often leads to learning. Like, you learn a lot of things that are bummers when you're in environmental, right? Things that are like not great. And one of the things that I learned about recently is the organization I work for put out this report that was about, the title was How Russian Conflict Birch Makes Its Way to American Consumers. And, I don't talk about current events much on this podcast, but, we are in a situation now where there's this war in Europe between, where Russia invaded Ukraine, and one of the biggest industries in Russia is timber. And they sell their timber all around the world, and now there's this situation where, people who are not supportive of that country don't necessarily want to buy things from that country, but Birch, in particular Birch plywood, had this very sneaky workaround where, particularly in the U.S., I think it was still happening in Europe too, and Europe has a little bit, I think had a little bit better control of it, but I think there were still things happening. But Birch plywood, particularly Birch plywood, was being harvested, and I think still is, harvested in Russia, and then sold to China, because they have a very big border with China.
Yeah.
And then further on, and I forget which process, whether it's being peeled into veneer or what process is happening, but then ultimately the birch plywood is being made in Vietnam and then imported into the United States.
Oh,
and by that time, its origin as being Russian is completely lost. You're like, where is this plywood from? It's from Vietnam. There's no birch in Vietnam. That's too far south. Birch is very widespread, but there's no Vietnamese birch. And so it's this really just interesting thing of our modern world about buying things and not really understanding the full supply chain and what impact that is having. Mm-hmm. And so when we just recently did a little remodel in our house, remodeled a bathroom, and when they were telling us what they were going to make a custom vanity, and one of the options was birch, and I was like, wait, where is the birch from? Yeah. And at first, the first vendor they had, which was cheaper, couldn't tell me.
Okay.
The second vendor was able to tell me that it was from the United States. Right? And so the price of that knowledge is are you inadvertently funding this war or not? Mm-hmm. Which I thought was really interesting. So, not everyone is in position to choose the more expensive thing, right? That's like a privilege I have to be able to choose that, but I did. But I just think it was a really excellent example of kind of like the complicated nature of like international commerce, and where this tree, birch, it can end up like becoming this complicated symbol of things going on in the world. So anyway, I was thinking a lot about that birch, particularly because I have this birch in this vanity. So that's what I wanted to share and why it was meaningful to me, because it really was just like I like this report had just come out. I just learned about it, and they were offering me this birch. I was like, wait, no, tell me what it is. And they're like, we don't know.
It's such a shame that they couldn't tell you where it came from. There's a concept around entangled value that I find really interesting. So my previous job was economic development, and I work in design, and using design as a tool for economic development. It's all a bit random anyway, but one of the main conferences around design for planet spoke about entangled value and how a thing that arrives at your home, whether it's a component for something that you're building or whether it's like this Sharpie that I'm holding and playing with right now, like there is a series of like you've got your carbon footprint, you've got your how ethical things are. And in terms of our consumption, like it's almost impossible to disentangle all of those values. And I think it's really interesting that you've brought that up, and that's a supply chain thing. Like that's just being able to say, well, it was here, and it originated here. And it's just so much harder for us as a society to be able to actually make good choices, not only because, you know, economically it might not be viable, but like you say, you're in a privileged position where that's something you could do, and I would be in the same position as well. But also just disentangling that knowledge is just incredible. And the fact that I can say I'm going to come on a podcast and talk about birch trees, and that can come up, is just a really interesting indicator of where we're at globally, you know? That's brilliant. And I hope the vanity is beautiful. Birch ply is gorgeous.
It is really nice, and this is actually mostly solid birch, which is also cool. It also made it a little more expensive, which it's painted, but it's very nice. Very happy with it. I'm glad I could find something that was more locally sourced. That there's one little thing here. You know, this is interesting. This birch plywood is a complicated supply chain from Russia to China to Vietnam to the United States, but it's actually pretty simple compared to other things. When you talk about the Sharpie and you think about the materials in that Sharpie, like where do those all come from? Very, very complicated. But with something like wood, we do have a little bit of power there as consumers of just asking the question. In general, people don't think about where wood comes from. When you buy a wooden product, a lot of people don't even just think about the question of like, wait, where did that tree grow? It's something now that I have that knowledge is something that I think about every time I consider buying a wood product. And sometimes you can't get to the bottom of it. And sometimes you need that product, and so you just got to do it.
Yeah.
But if you can make a better choice, and just starting with the knowledge of where it's from, sometimes where it's from is far away, and that can be okay. But when the companies aren't telling you where it's from, that's just a sign of that there probably is something going on.
Yeah.
And so that's what I try to do now. So that, you know, audience, I feel like that's a good tool for you to have. Particularly, you know, wood is good because there's like the supply chains are often shorter, right? Because you can see that it's wood. It's not completely modified and stuff like that. So a good place to start in like making those choices about positive impacts in how you buy things. Anyway, I could rant on about that for a very long time, but it's very interesting stuff.
Absolutely is. And just birch trees and that being the conversation. Who knew? Except, it's 2023. It all kind of comes back to that sort of thing, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yes, that broke one of my unspoken rules that I tell all my guests, but I haven't really mentioned in the podcast that I really try to avoid current events. But because in this case you're talking about birch, I feel like I had to bring it up, and it is, you know, it is a very terrible situation happening over there, and any way we can think to be more cognizant of it, and the birch plays that role, so very, very fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely is. I had no idea, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I look out too. I think you're luckier in Europe. Europe's got a little bit better consumer laws than the United States. And I think UK doesn't quite. UK's doing its own thing, right? Of course,
and that is
I forgot about
depressing.
I forgot about that. Just be on. You know, there is a lot of birch plywood out there. There's also a lot of solid birch. If a lot of it is made in Vietnam, and if it's made in Vietnam, it's probably from Russia. I have actually, before we go, I just have a couple quotes from that publication, which I'll link in the show notes. FSC and PFC, which are two organizations that certify sustainable timber, and they both have some problems that is too complicated for this podcast, but they're better than nothing. They have both declared timber coming from Russia as conflict timber. And so it can't be considered sustainable if it's coming from Russia right now, even if it is like harvested sustainably, because it's coming from an area where it could be funding that. In 2020, so pre the war, birch plywood accounted for more than 70% of U.S.'s timber imports from Russia. So a big piece of like what we were buying from Russia timber-wise was this birch plywood. And then in March and April of 2022, U.S. imports from Vietnam surged by more than 200%. So essentially, around that time, the Russian trade went down, but magically this Vietnam trade went up, and it's essentially just a laundering of that birch plywood. So, that's a really fascinating thing. Is how you can just see it in the trade data, how this workaround to get through importing this product.
That's amazing, and you're right. It is a bummer.
Sorry to end on that. You don't have any other poems written down or anything else? You can end on a lighter note.
I really don't. I think we might just need to let that one sit.
Okay.
Like that's quite a powerful message for the birch tree to put out there. You know.
Yeah, it's okay to sit with these things.
It is okay. Like, I think we have to. Like, yeah, not to sound too nihilistic, but this might be life now. So, yeah.
Now summer blinks on flowery breeze, and o'er the crystal streamlet's blaze. Come, let us spend the lightsome days in the Birch o' Aberfeldy. Bonny lassie, will ye go? Will ye go? Will ye go? Bonny lassie, will ye go to the Birch o' Aberfeldy? The little babbies blithely sing, while other heats the hazels hang, or lightly flit on wanton wing in the Birch o' Aberfeldy. The braes ascend like lofty walls, the foamy stream deep roaring falls, o'erhung with fragrance spreading shores, the Birch o' Aberfeldy. Bonny lassie, will ye go? Will ye go? Will ye go? Bonny lassie, will ye go to the Birch o' Aberfeldy? The hoary cliffs are crowned with floors, white o'er the lins the Burnie pours, and rising weeds with misty shores, the Birch o' Aberfeldy. Let fortune's gifts at random flee, they ne'er shall draw a wish fae me. Supremely blessed with love and thee in the Birch o' Aberfeldy. Bonny lassie, will ye go? Will ye go? Will ye go? Bonny lassie, will ye go to the Birch o' Aberfeldy?
That was The Birch of Aberfeldy by Robert Burns, as performed by Ronnie Brown of the Corries. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Rootbound. Thanks for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Lynn Campbell. Lynn is the host of the podcast Scotland on Shrooms. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. There will also be a link in the show notes. If you like Rootbound and want to help support the show, you can visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can contribute, including supporting the show on Patreon. Rootbound is hosted by Bonnie Ladd, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Creosote. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. But if you can go outside, come, let us spend the lightsome days in the Birch of Aberfeldy.
Diazotrophic bacteria, free the nitrogen.